To me, marketing's about values.
When we talk about marketing, what do we really mean? Ultimately, to me, it's persuasion on a mass scale. And you might be saying, well, what the hell does that mean? That's just a bunch of jargon, and you're right. So let me put it this way. Some people, and you know these types, have a presence about them in individual interactions. They use body language, tone of voice, and eye contact to get their message across. These are essentially subconscious cues, and we can all spot when someone is good at that because we've seen it. But not a lot of people are as adept at identifying this on a larger scale where you have to rely on others to get your message across. What Steve Jobs was alluding to in that first clip, and something he talked about endlessly, was the importance of creating an identity. The truth is, as much as we'd like to think of ourselves as rational decision makers, we're all susceptible to a few really simple techniques that reach into the subconscious and get us to connect to something.
This is a very complicated world. It's a very noisy world. And we're not going to get a chance to get people to remember much about us. And so we have to be really clear on what we want them to know about us.
And this stuff isn't all pretty either. I mean, a lot of it is used as manipulation or propaganda. But that's why I'm sharing it with you. Maybe you can actually do some good with it. To really get how this works, it's important to look at the historical context. Before companies learned how to do this, it was governments that were the most effective marketers. And the people most skilled in connecting to these underlying subconscious needs are, of course, artists. So now to some history. In 1917, the Russians pulled off one of the swiftest and most intense overthrows of a government ever seen. It was the Bolshevik Revolution, and it eventually led to the creation of the Soviet Union and the rise of communism. How'd they do it? Something called agitprop, or agitation propaganda. It's something that always fascinates me. It's like, where do these movements come from? Did a whole bunch of people just get the same idea at the same time, and then all of a sudden bell-bottoms exist? The real answer is so obvious when you figure it out, it makes you feel dumb for not knowing it in the first place. In almost every case, it's a small group of influential tastemakers that end up dictating the belief system of their time. In the case of the Soviets, most of the Russian population was illiterate. So Vladimir Lenin and the leaders of the time understood that they could be easily manipulated. And it helped tremendously that they had a team of brilliant artists on their side. These people weren't your run-of-the-mill painters and camera people. I mean, Eisenstein basically invented editing techniques that we still use today. Add to that people like Tatlin, Rodchenko, Vertov, and you basically had an all-star group of geniuses in their respective field. They created brilliantly persuasive pieces of film, painting, and architecture. The most moving of these, perhaps, is the Odessa steppe scene in the battleship Potemkin, which shows Russian soldiers basically massacring the protesting proletariat. That's a lot of peas. What's so powerful about this is how it connects to a larger growing idea that they're putting into the minds of the populace, more peace. The idea grows and grows until it becomes a belief shared by a now agitated and extremely powerful constituency. In this case, it was the idea that the working class were no longer second class, but the focal point of Soviet society. A group that was once forgotten was now empowered. And out of that, a persuasive formula started to emerge. Find a way to connect to a collective social emotion using art, rhetoric, and most importantly, repetition to spread your message. Let me say that again. Art, rhetoric, and repetition. Moving further along in history, you have the Nazis, who were able to turn a populace of educated, moral citizens into a racist group of marauding, world-domineering maniacs. Was there something in the water? The Nazis took what the Soviets did and built on it. And again, it was a group of what I would call unfortunately skilled people who put it in motion. This time it was less about the working masses and more about nationalism and the greatness of the German way of life, which didn't help anyone that was different than them. It also didn't help that film was at its peak as a persuasive tool, and it's not a coincidence that Hitler picked Leni Riefenstahl, one of the most skilled filmmakers in history, to head his propaganda. Once again, you had repetition, symbols of power and strength, simplicity of the message, a message that shutters down history and has inspired countless imitations since. That's a lot of S's. So why use artists? This is really important. It has to do with symbolism. Symbolism or subtext is just a way of saying something without saying it, or saying something by showing it. A lot of people don't know that Michelangelo's creation of Adam could be interpreted with the idea of God being created in our minds, or depending on your preference, God's gift being the human mind. It's not unlike falling in love that way. If it feels like someone is telling you to fall in love, it kind of ruins the experience, doesn't it? And in the same way, the tool of any art is to tell you a story. Through that story, they take your mind on a journey to some deeper meaning just far enough away out of the obvious that it gets you to think on your own. And the best art makes you believe in that idea while making it seem like it was your idea all along.
The way to do that is not to talk about speeds and beats. It's not to talk about MIPS and megahertz. It's not to talk about why we're better than Windows. The dairy industry tried for 20 years to convince you that milk was good for you. It's a lie, but they tried anyway. And the sales were going like this. And then they tried Got Milk, and the sales are going like this. Got Milk doesn't even talk about the product. Matter of fact, it focuses on the absence of the product.
The Americans saw this, understood its power, and began to push back. Naturally, they employed their own propaganda against it. So in steps an unfamiliar figure to the political world, Walt Disney. I bet you didn't see that coming. World War II wasn't just a battle of tanks and troops, it was a battle of ideas. Right here, you can start to see where the crossover began from political propaganda to corporate propaganda. Walt Disney was an absolutely brilliant salesman. You don't get stories about being frozen in an underground tomb unless you really made people feel something about your identity as an innovator. And once again, he had a team of artists at his disposal, already equipped with some of the most persuasive techniques of his time.
Disneyland is dedicated to the ideals, the dreams, and the hard facts that have created America, with the hope that it will be a source of joy and inspiration to all the world.
And out of that, I believe he started one of the first lifestyle brands. Let's go back to our formula. Art, rhetoric, and repetition centered around one idea. Walt Disney spoke repeatedly about the power of imagination to change our future. He used words like dreaming, laughter, tomorrow, and he built a religious fervor around his company and the experiences he loved to create. So that brings us all the way back to Steve Jobs, someone who was basically obsessed with the life of Walt Disney. Again, we see similar tropes of rebellion and revolution. This time, it was a lifestyle evolution rather than a political one. Again, we have a brilliant filmmaker like Ridley Scott helping to support the message in his own way.
And I thought it was such a dramatic idea that it would either be totally successful or would all get put in state pen.
Whether you still believe it or not, Apple's love for the innovator, the thinker, it works so well because it was connected to a feeling that a lot of people already had at the time.
But Apple's about something more than that. Apple, at the core, its core value, is that we believe that people with passion can change the world for the better.
The music and art of the 60s created a generation of rebels, and Steve Jobs benefited from that. Apple no longer appeals to that nostalgia. They're far more focused on selling design, which quite frankly has made them a lot easier to imitate. So it makes you wonder, what is the new marketing? Not only are the masses well educated, they're well versed in a new language, visual language. Something new is emerging. Audiences are demanding smarter, deeper, more authentic messages. So we see more vlogs, more off-the-cuff prognostications, and more direct insight into the lives of persuasive people. But while the internet has given us new license to create more authentic stories and public figures, it's important to remember, our unconscious mind yearns for something more, a challenge or a puzzle, something that will take us on a journey. Or, I guess a more persuasive way of saying it is, symbolism works. It will always work.